You're listening to the audiobook for Elvis and the Beatles by Trina Young. Copyright 2018. All rights reserved. Chapter 7, Breakups and Comebacks. Quote, "The Beatles will just go on and on. The Beatles, I think, exist without us." George Harrison. Throughout 1968, the Beatles' new company, Apple, was spending money like water. The group had started funding creative endeavors for other artists. Unfortunately, many of the business ventures were being run by people without good business sense. For example, the Apple boutique in London was such a disaster that the Beatles decided to close it in July 1968, only 8 months after it opened, and all the merchandise was given away for free. In January 1969, John Lennon was quoted as saying, "Apple is losing money every week. If it carries on like this, all of us will be broke in the next 6 months, unquote." The Beatles were losing money fast, and even though they attempted to manage themselves after Brian Epstein's death, they still needed attorneys to clear up certain legal and financial matters. Paul McCartney had great faith in his soon-to-be in-laws, Linda's family, the Eastmans, who were successful entertainment lawyers in the U.S. They began advising him on financial matters. However, the other three Beatles did not trust the Eastmans because they did not think they were objective since they had close ties to Paul. They wanted someone from the outside to represent them as their business manager. Enter Alan Klein. If there was anyone who could rival Colonel Parker in terms of negotiating record contracts and making shrewd business deals, it was Alan Klein. Klein, a native of New Jersey, was known as, quote, "an effective sleuth who could root through record companies' books on behalf of artists and find thousands of dollars in unpaid royalties," unquote. John, George and Ringo were committed to having Klein become their manager. For another client, the Rolling Stones, Klein had obtained a better royalty rate for them on their records, an even better rate than the Beatles had. Quote, "The artists all wanted someone like Alan to go fight the record companies. They wanted a bully," said Klein biographer Fred Goodman. He was aggressively advocating for artists. In the 1960s, the notion that artists have leverage and are grossly underpaid was a revelation, unquote. Just like Colonel Parker, Klein had great success for his previous clients when dealing with RCA. According to Goodman, in 1964, Klein approached Brian Epstein with an offer for the Beatles to sign with RCA for $2 million, but Epstein turned him down, expressing loyalty to EMI. But Klein did not have a clean record. In years to come, news would come out that Klein had kept major amounts of money from his clients like the Rolling Stones and Donovan. The Eastmans advised Paul not to sign a contract with him. But majority rules, and since the other three Beatles agreed, as of May 1969, Klein officially became the Beatles' manager. "My impression of him when I first met him was brash," Ringo Starr said. "I'll get it done, lads." Lots of enthusiasm. "A good guy, with a pleasant attitude about himself in a really gross New York way," unquote. Klein was able to get the Beatles a better royalty rate with EMI, which extended their contract through 1976 and allowed EMI to repackage old material. Although Paul couldn't complain about the new royalty rate, he never signed the contract giving Klein permission to represent him individually. "Because we were all from Liverpool, we favored people who were street people," explained George Harrison. Lee Eastman was more like a class-conscious type of person. "As John was going with Klein, it was much easier if we went with him too," unquote. With Klein dividing the group, the tension between the Beatles rose to new heights, with Paul now pitted against John, George and Ringo. Meanwhile, McCartney, the workaholic of the group, got the Beatles together in early 1969 to record a new album, raw and stripped of production. The Beatles did not want George Martin producing this album since it was intended to be reminiscent of their less polished, earlier days of rock and roll. Since the Beatles weren't getting along very well, once the sessions were completed it was a relief to all. As a result, they left all the tapes in storage for over a year, until they decided to ask Phil Spector to produce the album. Although the Let It Be sessions were completed during the month of January 1969, the album was not released until May 8, 1970. As a result, Abbey Road, which was recorded months after Let It Be, was actually released before the Let It Be album, making Let It Be the last of the Beatles albums to be released. Since Brian Epstein's death, the Beatles were becoming less and less of a tight unit and more like four separate musicians who happened to play together sometimes. Without Brian to guide them as a whole, they were falling apart. Paul McCartney wanted to tour again, but John, George and Ringo weren't interested. The compromise was to film a documentary of their recording sessions, which would become Let It Be. It was during the Let It Be sessions that the Beatles made their last public performance together as a group. On January 30, 1969, the Beatles performed a mini-concert around lunchtime live on the rooftop of Apple's Savile Row headquarters in London. They performed for 42 minutes until the police came and stopped the show due to noise complaints. From 30 days of recording sessions, 28 hours of film were shot and over 100 hours of music were recorded. Of the roughly 70 new and old songs recorded, only 12 made it on the album, with dozens showing up on countless bootlegs over the years. The film, Let It Be, is a raw account of how the Beatles' relationship as friends and musicians was disintegrating. The film premiered in May 1970 and none of the Beatles attended the premiere. The movie was released on VHS in the early 1980s, but was never officially released on DVD. Numerous bootlegs or unofficial copies of the film have been circulating ever since. During the summer of 1969, the Beatles recorded one last time with George Martin. Somehow they put aside their differences and created one of their best albums ever. The Beatles' Abbey Road album was released on September 26, 1969. For the first time, one of George Harrison's songs, Something, was released as a single. It went to number 1 in the US and number 4 in the UK, establishing George as a talented songwriter in his own right. On August 8, 1969, the Beatles were photographed for the cover of the album. The cover featured the Beatles walking across the street in the crosswalk right in front of EMI Studios, located on Abbey Road in London, where they had recorded the majority of their songs as a group. The cover photograph became iconic, and as a result, EMI Studios were renamed to Abbey Road Studios in 1970. Fans to this day flock to the busy street crossing to take their picture imitating the Beatles walking across Abbey Road. Abbey Road became the biggest-selling Beatles album in the US up to that point, selling 5 million copies in the first year of release, which was 2 million more than Sgt. Pepper had sold. Meanwhile, Elvis Presley was experiencing a musical comeback, returning to live concerts in a big way. After the success of his 1968 TV special, the Colonel was in talks to have Elvis perform live in Las Vegas. Quote, "By dumb luck, the movie years had the effect of preserving Elvis economically while the wild music environment passed over," said music journalist Michael Streiskoth. Elvis was not spent from years of musical rejection, so when the time was right and people were ready to see him in concert, he was fresh and ready to pounce on the opportunity. Inadvertently, Parker's decisions in the early and mid-60s gave us the great Elvis music of the very late 60s and early 70s, unquote. The Colonel negotiated a deal for $500,000 for Presley to perform for 4 weeks at the International Hotel in Las Vegas starting in July 1969. This was the start of Presley's reign in Vegas. He would perform more than 700 sold-out shows at the International through 1976. After the success of the Las Vegas shows in the summer of 1969, Elvis Presley's career was on fire. Not only appearing in Vegas, but around the country, Elvis performed at the Houston Astrodome for 3 nights in a row beginning February 27, 1970 for a fee of $150,000. In November 1969, Presley reached number 1 with the song Suspicious Minds. It would be his last number 1 US single before his death. While on tour in Los Angeles, Elvis displayed a rare moment of bragging in public to his concert audience in November 1970, "I've got 56 gold singles and 14 gold albums. If there's anyone out there who doubts it, if you ever come through Memphis, you can come in and argue about it, 'cause I've got every one of them hanging on the wall. I'm really proud of it. I've outsold the Beatles, the Stones, Tom Jones, all of them put together," unquote. From October 1969 to March 1970, Paul McCartney decided to take a long break. He wanted to spend time with his new wife, Linda, and new daughter, Mary, born in August 1969. During the summer, a radio DJ in Detroit announced a set of clues suggesting that Paul McCartney had died in 1966 and was replaced by an imposter, named William Campbell. He offered several clues from Beatles songs and album covers to support his theory. The Paul is dead rumor spread like wildfire across the U.S., so much so that Life magazine was intent on proving that Paul was still alive. They tracked him down on his farm in Scotland, and he appeared with his family on the cover of Life on November 7, 1969. The cover read, "The Case of the Missing Beatle, Paul is still with us." In the article, McCartney was quoted as saying, "If I were dead, I'd be the last to know." Meanwhile, John Lennon found in Yoko Ono a new direction for his life. He was not happy being a cute Beatle. He was ready to move on to new things. Yoko gave him the encouragement and support he needed to break out on his own. "We both think alike," John said about Yoko. "And we've both been alone. We both had these dreams, the same kind of dreams. I had this dream of this woman coming," unquote. John was spending most of his time with Yoko, but forced himself to make time to record again with the Beatles. However, it was just a matter of time before he would express his desire to leave the group. Lennon had first publicly expressed discontent with his role as a Beatle back in March 1966 with the controversial "We're More Popular Than Jesus" interview he did with Maureen Cleave in the London Evening Standard. Lennon stated, "You see, there's something else I'm going to do, something I must do, only I don't know what it is. That's why I go round painting and taping and drawing and writing and that, because it may be one of them. All I know is, this isn't it for me," unquote. Lennon would be the first Beatle to perform solo in public when he took to the stage in September 1969 at the Toronto Rock and Roll Revival Festival with the Plastic Ono Band, an avant-garde rock band he formed with Yoko. The band featured a rotating lineup of musicians, including Eric Clapton and Klaus Voormann, and served as a vehicle for their own projects. John was ready to quit the Beatles after his performance in Toronto, but he was convinced to stay because of financial and legal matters regarding the Beatles' record contract. Alan Klein reportedly urged Lennon not to announce that he wanted to quit because it would jeopardize Klein's negotiations with EMI over royalties. John Lennon had also started releasing singles on his own, without the Beatles. In July 1969, he released "Give Peace a Chance," which was then followed by "Cold Turkey" in October 1969. Both singles were credited to the Plastic Ono Band. In February 1970, Lennon released "Instant Karma," which would end up competing with the Beatles' "Let It Be" on the charts. It probably didn't help group cohesiveness when, on February 7, 1970, John Lennon was featured on the cover of Rolling Stone magazine as their Man of the Year. He was recognized for all his political activities in a call for peace with his wife, Yoko Ono. Between 1968 and 1969, John, George and Ringo had all previously proclaimed internally that they quit the Beatles. George and Ringo returned, while John had quietly left in September 1969, but never announced it. Paul was the only Beatle who wanted to keep the band together at that point, but when he sensed that there was no hope, he decided to release a statement announcing the obvious, that the Beatles were breaking up. Included in the press kit for his first solo album, McCartney, released in April 1970, Paul included a set of questions that Peter Brown came up with to answer regarding the status of the Beatles, including the following. Peter Brown, is your break with the Beatles temporary or permanent, due to personal differences or musical ones? Paul McCartney, personal differences, business differences, but most of all because I have a better time with my family. Temporary or permanent? I don't know. Peter Brown, do you foresee a time when Lennon-McCartney becomes an active songwriting partnership again? Paul McCartney, no. McCartney's answers expressed that he was estranged from the Beatles and would work on his own in the future. The press picked up on it and ran headlines on April 10, 1970 that Paul was quitting the group and the Beatles were through. John was frustrated that Paul was the one to announce to the world that the Beatles were breaking up since he had been ready to leave months before. Quote, a lot of people knew I'd left, but I was a fool not to do what Paul did, which is to use it to sell a record, John Lennon said in December 1970. I wasn't angry. We were all hurt that he didn't tell us what he was going to do. I was cursing because I hadn't done it, unquote. To legally end the group, Paul asked John, George and Ringo to let him out of the contract with Alan Klein. They refused. This led Paul to sue the other three Beatles to end his legal association with them. On December 31, 1970, Paul filed a suit against John, George, Ringo, Alan Klein and Apple to officially dissolve the band. This led to some bitter name-calling in the coming years between John and Paul, evident in specific songs on their solo albums. Finally, on January 9, 1975, a judge ruled that the Beatles as an entity no longer existed. Of course, the world was shocked and the Beatles broke up. It was the end of an era. For years to come, people would always yearn for the Beatles to get back together, and the press would always ask the ex-Beatles about any chance of a reunion whenever possible. As years went on, people started to realize that the Beatles phenomenon was a once-in-a-lifetime occurrence. Even though all four members went on to establish themselves as successful solo artists, it wasn't the same. The energy and creativity that was created when these four men worked together was magical. Quote, "We have depended for such a long time on the Beatles for our public and private amusements, for styles and attitudes, that such a prospect is frightening," said Rolling Stone founder, Jan Wenner, in February 1970. In a fragmenting world, where the quick dissolve has replaced the slow fade, the Beatles forever has been something that has kept us together. We are afraid of their coming apart, because if they did, we might as well, unquote. Regarding the myth that Lennon's wife, Yoko Ono, broke up the Beatles, John stated in an appearance on the Dick Cavett Show in 1971, "Yoko didn't split the Beatles because how could one girl split the Beatles, or one woman? The Beatles were drifting apart on their own," unquote. It was sad that the ending of the group became a bitter entanglement focused on money and legalities. But the truth was that the brotherhood of these four men had dissipated. They had grown up together and had grown creatively together, but with all the talent between them, they were eager to each pursue their own interests. They each wanted total control of their creative endeavors, and they each went off in slightly different directions. "The king is always killed by his courtiers, not by his enemies," John Lennon said in an interview with Newsweek in October 1980. "The king is overfed, overdrugged, overindulged, anything to keep the king tied to his throne. Most people in that position never wake up. They either die mentally or physically, or both. And what Yoko did for me, apart from liberating me to be a feminist, was to liberate me from that situation. And that's how the Beatles ended," Lennon continued. "Not because Yoko split the Beatles, but because she showed me what it was to be Elvis Beatle, and to be surrounded by sycophants and slaves who were only interested in keeping the situation as it was. And that's a kind of death," unquote. A great injustice in all this was that the biggest recording artists of the decade were still cash poor. In a February 1970 interview, Lennon stated that none of the Beatles were millionaires. Quote, "Brian was a nice guy, but he knew what he was doing, he robbed us," said John Lennon in December 1970. "He took all the money, and looked after himself and his family and all that. And it's just a myth. I hate the way that Alan is attacked and Brian is made like an angel, just 'cause he's dead. He wasn't, he was just a guy," unquote. But as the legal case ensued led by McCartney, the other three Beatles learned that Klein had been ripping them off as well. The tables turned and, in addition to McCartney, John, George and Ringo had to sue Klein as well. "I single-handedly saved the Beatle empire, haha," Paul McCartney told Barry Miles in the 1990s. "I can laugh about it now, it was not so funny at the time. It certainly did not make me the most popular man in Britain. It was very, very traumatic and there was no great joy in winning except I knew that justice had been done," unquote. The Beatles company, Apple, finally disentangled themselves away from any control by Alan Klein in January 1977. The company in the present day runs quite successfully, headed by CEO Jeff Jones, with frequent input from Paul, Ringo, Yoko and George's widow, Olivia Harrison. In 1970, Lennon, McCartney, Harrison and Starr officially went their separate ways and would each forever be labeled as a former Beatle for the rest of their lives and careers. Quote, If Brian had lived, there wouldn't have been the complications of management where you had two camps, you had the Alan Klein camp and you had Paul's camp, explained George Martin. But the Beatles would have split up after a while anyway. It was quite remarkable that they lasted a decade together. It's pretty tough staying together when you have that kind of degree of success and you want your own life, unquote. Each of the four Beatles approached the breakup in different ways. John Lennon felt he was finally free to pursue his own interests, especially political activism with Yoko. In July 1970, Lennon wanted to organize a Canadian peace concert. He tried to get the other Beatles and even Elvis to perform. However, the concert never happened. Paul McCartney admitted years later that he was on the verge of a nervous breakdown after the band's split. He didn't know how to move forward, and he credits his wife, Linda, for helping him to pick up the pieces and start over with a new band called Wings. George Harrison finally got to show the world what he could do as a songwriter. He released his triple album, All Things Must Pass, in November 1970. It spent 7 weeks at number 1 in the US and is considered the most successful album ever released by an ex-Beatle. Ringo Starr pursued a movie career, but also had success as a solo artist. In 1973, he had 2 number 1 hits in the US with Photograph and You're 16. If there was any question if the Beatles were truly broken up, that idea was put to rest when John Lennon's first post-Beatles solo album, John Lennon Plastic Ono Band, was released on December 11, 1970. The album featured the song God, which told Beatles fans quite literally that the dream was over. Another message Lennon conveyed in God was how he had lost faith in just about everything, except his relationship with his wife. He spouted off a list of famous religious and political figures that he did not believe in anymore. At the end of the list were Elvis, Bob Dylan, Zimmerman, and the Beatles. Was it possible that Elvis Presley heard this new song off Lennon's album? Maybe Lennon's outright rejection of Presley gave Elvis the impetus 10 days later to disrespect the Beatles to the President of the United States, calling them anti-American. However, it wasn't all cut and dried as to what motivated him to say it, or even if he really believed it. In December 1970, Elvis had a spontaneous impulse while flying to Washington, D.C. to try to meet President Nixon. Fueled by his passion for guns and police badges, he was determined to get an official federal agent narcotics badge. During the plane ride, Presley wrote an impassioned letter to the president requesting a meeting. Written on American Airlines stationery, the 5-page letter also expressed Elvis's desire to help with the war on drugs. Here's an excerpt. Quote, "The drug culture, the hippie elements, the SDS, Black Panthers, etc. do not consider me as their enemy, or as they call it, the establishment. I call it America and I love it. Sir, I can and will be of any service that I can to help the country out. I can and will do more good if I were made a federal agent at large, and I will help out by doing it my way through my communications with people of all ages," unquote. The letter, which Presley personally delivered to White House security guards after arriving on a red-eye flight, set off a chain of events that hours later had the king of rock and roll shaking hands with the most powerful man in the world. Security prevented Presley from presenting the president with his unique gift, a World War II-era Colt .45 pistol, but Nixon's aides accepted it on his behalf. At 12:30 p.m. on December 21, 1970, Elvis Presley was welcomed into the Oval Office of the White House. According to Egil Bud Crow, deputy counsel to the president, who was present at the meeting, Presley quickly began trying to convince Nixon that he was, quote, on his side, that he wanted to be helpful and that he wanted to restore some respect for the flag which was being lost, unquote. To justify his position, Presley specifically named the Beatles as a threat to America's youth. The White House meeting notes describe this exchange. Quote, Presley indicated that he thought the Beatles had been a real force for anti-American spirit. He said that the Beatles came to this country, made their money, and then returned to England where they promoted an anti-American theme. The president nodded in agreement and expressed some surprise. The president then indicated that those who use drugs are also those in the vanguard of anti-American protest. Violence, drug usage, dissent, protest all seem to merge in generally the same group of young people, unquote. While Presley's remarks may seem like an outright attack on the Fab Four, it is not likely that Elvis had it out for the Beatles. According to Jerry Schilling, Elvis loved the Beatles. Schilling explained that Elvis was just trying to look more patriotic to the president and, in effect, used the Beatles as a scapegoat. This meeting was held in private and the details of what was said did not come out until years later. As we know, Presley would never criticize another musician or singer in public, even though the Beatles had criticized Elvis a few times before in public. Whatever Elvis's real motive for calling out the Beatles in this historic meeting, the end result was in his favor. He received a federal agent narcotics badge from President Nixon. As the Washington Post reported, quote, "See that he gets it," the president directed his top enforcement advisor, Egil Bud Crow. Unable to suppress his excitement, Elvis hugged the startled Nixon, unquote. As he left the meeting, Elvis told Schilling and Sonny West, who had both accompanied him to the White House, who said something can't be done, unquote. Even though Elvis had dissed the Beatles to President Nixon, he reportedly kept in touch with John Lennon. According to Larry Geller, John Lennon was Presley's favorite Beatle. Quote, "Elvis loved crazy, almost absurd humor, and I think that really surprised the Beatles," recalled Schilling. Personality-wise, John really reminded me of the more cutting side of Elvis, the side you never saw in his movies. Elvis was sharp and fast and could cut through you with a remark, but usually only the few of us who lived with him ever saw that side of him. It came out that night with John, though, unquote. When the Beatles met Presley in 1965, Elvis and John discovered they shared an appreciation of Peter Sellers and began reciting lines from his movies. Quote, "John's in with Elvis started with talking about Peter Sellers and the Pink Panther and Dr. Strangelove," said Lennon's former girlfriend during the 1970s, May Pang. It was something they had in common. John could imitate Peter Sellers as Inspector Clouseau in the Pink Panther movies, and he had heard Elvis was a fan of Sellers. It was pure fright, and this was all that would come out of his mouth at the first sight of Elvis. He was very relieved when Elvis laughed, unquote. The Beatles had Presley's phone number at Graceland, and in the late 60s, Elvis supposedly gave Lennon some advice. Once when John was in trouble for drugs and they were going to deport him, he called Elvis, revealed Larry Geller. "And I don't know what Elvis did, but Lennon stayed in the country," unquote. Specifically, in 1969, Lennon wanted to hold one of his bed-ins for peace in the U.S., but he was not allowed in the country due to a drug arrest the year before in England, which was actually a set-up. According to Geller, Elvis gave John Lennon advice to make an anti-drug statement. In December 1969 in Canada, Lennon did just that. John and Yoko took a break from their peace campaign to give an interview in which Lennon spoke candidly about drugs. Quote, "It's no good us preaching at people and saying don't take them because that doesn't work. But if people take any notice of what we say we've been through the drug scene, man, and there's nothing like being straight. You need hope, and hope is something that you have to build up within yourself," unquote. It seemed to have worked since Lennon was able to return to the States in August 1971. Also, when Lennon was being threatened with deportation from the U.S. starting in March 1972, Elvis put Lennon in contact with some people he knew could help. Another thing that Lennon and Presley had in common besides their sense of humor was fear for their personal safety. In 1969, during John and Yoko's peace campaign, John was filmed reading a letter from a fan as he and Yoko were sitting in bed. "Dear Mr. Lennon, from information I received while using a Ouija board, I believe that there will be an attempt to assassinate you. The spirit that gave me this information was Brian Epstein. Mr. Epstein also said that Paul McCartney was alive in London," unquote. It might have seemed like just another crazy letter from a fan, but that wasn't the only warning Lennon got. John had premonitions that he would die a violent death starting as early as 1965 during the height of Beatlemania. Quote, "He would blurt out his morbid inklings in flippant comments, predicting he'd probably be popped off by some loony," explained Lennon historian, Shelley Germo. In 1965 he told Sonny Freeman, whom he was having an affair with, that he didn't think he would live a long life, that he'd had a premonition he'd be shot, continued Germo. He even seemed to enact the idea in film. Anyone who has watched his portrayal of Private Gripweed in How I Won the War will shudder at the scene where he is hit with an explosion, falls to the ground, then looks up at the camera, obviously about to die, and says sadly, "I knew this would happen," unquote. In 1966, Lennon received a letter from a psychic warning that he would be shot in the U.S. Quote, "The psychic's warning remained in his mind, and from then on, it seemed as he was looking over his shoulder, waiting for the gunman to appear," said John Lennon's first wife Cynthia. He often used to say, "I'll be shot one day," unquote. Meanwhile, in the summer of 1970, there was a credible threat to Elvis Presley's life while he was performing in Las Vegas. Presley was so worried that he called in Jerry Schilling to serve as an extra bodyguard during one of his concerts at the International Hotel. A promotional menu for Presley's show was slid under his door one night. The frightening thing was that Elvis's picture had been crossed out and the words, "I am going to kill you," were written on the paper. Quote, "The FBI says it looks like the real thing and we have to take it seriously," Presley told Schilling. "The hotel said I didn't have to do the show, but I'm not going to let this MF push me off the stage. I wanted you and Red and Sonny here to watch my back. I don't want anybody going around saying they killed Elvis Presley," Elvis continued. "If anything happens out there, forget about me. You go get the son of a bitch and rip his eyes out," unquote. Elvis put on a strong performance that night, according to Schilling. He recounts that at one point during the show, as the lights dimmed, a male voice yelled out from the balcony, "Elvis." Thinking that this may be the prospective perpetrator, Elvis growled back, "Yeah?" As Jerry, Red and Sonny, who were positioned at different locations in the showroom, took their stances and reached for their guns, the balcony voice asked, "Would you sing Hound Dog?" To everyone's relief, Elvis finished the show without incident and the potential assassin was never heard from again. As John Lennon was adapting to life in the U.S., a reporter from Melody Maker visited him in October 1971 at the St. Regis Hotel in New York City where he was staying. During the interview, Lennon happened to be working on a new project. "I'm gonna have a jukebox with just Elvis records on it. Isn't it great?" Lennon told the reporter. "I asked someone to get all his old singles for me," Lennon said, as he knelt down on his hands and knees, sorting through the box of records, spilling the bright red RCA labels all over the floor. "The next 10 minutes were spent sorting the singles out," described the reporter. "John put the singles for songs like My Baby Left Me, Hound Dog, One Night and the Old Sun records in one pile, while other singles that John referred to as crap, like Bossa Nova Baby and Are You Lonesome Tonight, go in another pile." 1 year earlier, Ringo visited Elvis backstage at one of his Las Vegas shows in early 1970. Ringo was attending the U.S. premiere of his film The Magic Christian, in Los Angeles, and then he and his wife Maureen flew to Las Vegas to see Presley perform at the International Hotel. After the show, Ringo was invited up to Elvis's penthouse suite. Reportedly, Elvis asked Ringo to be in a proposed closed-circuit concert special that he was considering doing. Though Ringo had to decline as negotiations went on too long, Ringo said Elvis understood why he could not appear, according to authors Mike Eder and Joseph Tunzi. The concert special would become the feature film, Elvis That's the Way It Is, which documented Presley's Vegas concerts in August 1970. On August 28, 1971, Elvis Presley received the Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award, albeit with little fanfare. He declined an offer to appear at the Grammy Award ceremony. "Elvis don't appear without being paid," Colonel Parker told the Grammy representatives. "I don't know that he'll appear anyway." The Recording Academy threatened to not give Elvis the award if he did not appear at the awards show. But in the end, they privately presented Elvis with the award in his dressing room in Las Vegas. In June 1972, Elvis played a record-breaking 4 sold-out shows at Madison Square Garden in New York. Presley earned rave reviews for these shows, being hailed like a prince from another planet by the New York Times reviewer. Many celebrities attended the shows, including Bob Dylan, David Bowie, Simon and Garfunkel, members of Led Zeppelin, an up-and-comer named Bruce Springsteen, and former Beatle George Harrison. George went to see Elvis backstage at the concert. Quote, "At that time, I had my uniform, the worn-out denim jacket and jeans, looked like a rag man, and I had a big beard and mustache, and long hair down to my waist," George Harrison recalled. "They took me back in the intermission to meet Elvis again and he was in the back of the dressing room. and finally he came out of the back and he was immaculate. I felt like this real grubby little slug, and he looked like Lord Shiva or something," Harrison continued. "He seemed to be about 8 feet tall and his hair was black and his tan was perfect, and he had this big white suit, a gold belt about 4 feet wide, and he was towering above me and I just put a hand out and said, 'Hello Elvis, how are you?' just cowering like this little ragman," unquote. In the Beatles anthology film from 1995, Harrison intimated that at the time he did not like Elvis's 1970s sound and wished he would go back to singing his old 1950s hits. Harrison was also said to have written a song for Elvis titled Beautiful Girl, which he instead ended up recording on his own 33 1/3 album in 1976. John Lennon was rumored to have attended the Madison Square Garden concert also, but he did not. John would have many reasons why he did not go and see Elvis perform in the 1970s, including the excuses that he only liked Presley's early music, that he would get disappointed by live performances in general because he was a record man, and his good old stubborn pride. "I'd like to see him in Vegas because that's where he's supposed to be at home," Lennon said in 1975. "But I'd be embarrassed if they said, 'and there in the audience is John Lennon.' I'd hate it. I'm dying to see him," unquote. Ironically, just 2 months after Presley's shows in New York, Lennon was on stage himself at Madison Square Garden performing 2 benefit shows called 1 to 1 on August 30, 1972. During the afternoon and evening shows, which were later released as the John Lennon Live in New York City album, he sings Presley's Hound Dog. Lennon shouts, "Elvis, I love ya," during the song. While the Beatles sang All You Need Is Love on the first ever live TV global satellite broadcast in June 1967, Elvis Presley would become the first performer to have a full concert broadcast via global satellite. On January 14, 1973, Presley's Aloha from Hawaii concert was aired live from Honolulu, Hawaii across the continents of Asia, Australia and islands in the Pacific. Everywhere else the concert was broadcast from videotape at a later date. No admission was charged for the show, but contributions were requested to raise money for the Ku'e Cancer Fund. The concert was not aired in the U.S. until April 4, 1973 because the January date conflicted with the Super Bowl. The NBC broadcast would be its highest-rated program of the year, attracting 51% of the TV viewing audience. While Colonel Parker boasted that the concert was seen by over 1 billion people in 40 countries, Elvis historians have recently calculated that the number of viewers was closer to 250 million in 21 countries, still an historic achievement. During the concert, the guy who dissed the Beatles to President Nixon just a few years earlier would give ultimate respect to the group by performing their song Something. At the end of the show, Elvis would throw his jeweled American Eagle cape which matched his white jumpsuit into the audience. After the live show, Colonel Parker wrote a rare letter of praise to Elvis saying, "You above all make all of it work by being the leader and the talent. Without your dedication to your following it couldn't have been done," unquote. Meanwhile, later that same year, John Lennon went to see Jerry Lee Lewis perform at the Roxy in Los Angeles. "I had only 3 childhood idols," John told friend Elliot Mintz. "Elvis, Carl Perkins and Jerry Lee, and I haven't seen any live. Let's go." After the show, John met Jerry Lee backstage. He got down on his hands and knees and kissed Lewis's boots. "That's all right, son," Lewis told him. "You just get up now." John was in a nostalgic mood during this period of time called the Lost Weekend when he was separated from Yoko. She had kicked him out of their apartment in the Dakota Building in New York City in September 1973, so Lennon went to Los Angeles with assistant May Pang, who became his girlfriend for about 18 months. According to May Pang, Lennon enjoyed telling the story and reliving the 4-hour visit with the king of rock and roll. "Meeting Elvis was one of the biggest highlights of John's life," said May Pang. "Every time he talked about Elvis, I noticed how happy he was," unquote. In October 1973, Lennon started recording his rock and roll album, which was a tribute to the 1950s music he loved so much. The album included songs by rock and roll pioneers including Fats Domino and Chuck Berry. It also featured a medley of Rip It Up and Ready Teddy, songs that both Elvis Presley and Little Richard sang. Even though Lennon was prompted to do the album of oldies as a result of the lawsuit against him by Chuck Berry's music publisher, he felt a great degree of nostalgia while recording the album. "I thought, is this some kind of karmic thing?" Lennon said. "Here I am with this old picture of me in Hamburg from '61, and I'm ending as I started, singing this straight rock and roll stuff," unquote. The cover featured the photo of a 20-year-old John Lennon in Hamburg taken in April 1961 by friend and photographer, Jürgen Vollmer. The photo showed Lennon with slick-back Elvis hair and wearing a leather jacket. "I was inspired by John's cool, arrogant, above-it-all rocker look," recalled Vollmer. "He wasn't that way really, but he projected that image," unquote. In the photo, there are blurry figures of three people walking past Lennon as he stands in a doorway. They are none other than Paul McCartney, George Harrison and Stuart Sutcliffe. The album was released in February 1975. Evident in his public appearances in late 1974 and early 1975, Lennon definitely had Presley on his mind. In November 1974, John Lennon is filmed wearing a large round Elvis picture button. The lenticular button has two images of Elvis from 1956 which alternate depending on the angle. Lennon is wearing the button on the lapel of his all-black outfit when he filmed a promotional video for his song Whatever Gets You Through the Night. A BBC film crew followed him around Central Park and other parts of New York City, and the Elvis button was prominently visible on Lennon. Quote, "I'm an Elvis fan because it was Elvis who really got me out of Liverpool. If I can pin it on anyone, Elvis probably, John said in an interview in March 1975. The real thing was the music. Once I heard it and got into it, that was life, there was no other thing, just music and sex. I thought of nothing else apart from sex and food and money," unquote. On March 1, 1975, John Lennon was a presenter at the Grammy Awards ceremony in New York. He is wearing a large Elvis pin on his lapel, where Elvis was spelled out in rhinestone letters. In a June 1975 interview with Rolling Stone magazine, John Lennon was asked if there was anyone that he'd like to produce, like Bob Dylan, for example. Lennon had just finished producing an album for singer Harry Nilsson the year before. "Dylan would be interesting because I think he made a great album in Blood on the tracks, but I'm still not keen on the backings. I think I could produce him great," John Lennon responded. And Presley. "I'd like to resurrect Elvis. But I'd be so scared of him I don't know whether I could do it. But I'd like to do it. Dylan, I could do, but Presley would make me nervous. But Dylan or Presley, somebody up there. I know what I'd do with Presley. Make a rock and roll album," unquote. Meanwhile, in March 1975, Barbra Streisand was working on a remake of the Hollywood classic, A Star Is Born. She was looking for a leading man and she thought Elvis Presley would be the perfect choice. Elvis never gave up his desire to be a serious actor. Jerry Schilling recalled that in the 60s, Elvis used to ask producer Hal Wallace, "When do I get my Beckett?" The movie, Beckett, was a drama which starred Richard Burton and Peter O'Toole, and was produced by Wallace. The film represented a chance for Elvis to play a more dramatic role. Maybe a serious role like the male lead in A Star Is Born would have been Presley's Beckett. Unfortunately, the circumstances were not right. Ginger Alden, Presley's 20-year-old fiancée in the final year of his life, explains that it was Elvis's decision not to take the role. According to Alden, Elvis had two reasons why he did not want to make the film. First, he did not like the fact that his character would kill himself at the end. Second, he did not trust the proposed director John Peters, a former Hollywood hairstylist with no proven track record in filmmaking. Elvis was one of the biggest movie stars in the 1960s and had worked with several top-notch Hollywood directors including Michael Curtiz, Casablanca, and Don Siegel, Dirty Harry. So, it only made sense that Elvis would prefer to work with an established director and be wary of a newcomer. Apparently, during a meeting to discuss the movie with John Peters and Barbra Streisand on March 30, 1975 in Las Vegas, Elvis noticed Peters yawning. "Man, I just couldn't see him directing it," Elvis told Ginger. Ironically, in August 1975, the movie studio announced that screenwriter-director Frank Pearson would take over as director for A Star Is Born, leaving Peters with a producing credit shared with Streisand. But by that point, negotiations had ended on Elvis's behalf between Colonel Parker and Streisand. While it is true that there were difficulties in the contract negotiations with Colonel Parker involving top billing for Elvis and managerial control among other issues, Elvis biographer Peter Guralnick believes no manager would have gone for that deal. In defense of Colonel Parker, Guralnick says, the decision was made from the standpoint of Elvis's interests. Many historians and fans look back on Presley's career and wished Elvis would have left the Colonel by the mid-1970s. But as one observer said, I think Elvis is afraid he'd lose everything if the Colonel wasn't there to guide him. Another artist who wanted to work with Elvis in the 1970s was Paul McCartney. During his London Town album recording sessions, which began in February 1977, Paul wrote a song specifically for Elvis called Name and Address. Elvis died before Paul could send him a demo of the song. Unfortunately, after the legendary Elvis-Beatles meeting in 1965, Paul McCartney never